Administrative Assistant in the President's Office at the South Dakota School Mines. Thank you all for coming tonight, and thank you to those of you who are attending virtually as well. We've been doing Steam Cafe since April of 2018. We do this once a month. Appreciate your support. This is a partnership with South Dakota Public Broadcasting and Hay Brewing, and we appreciate their support as well. For those of you who are attending online, two things. If the audio is not coming through clearly, please let me know in the chat, and we will do what we can to fix any issues. Second thing, at the end of the presentation, there will be a question and answer session. If you have questions, please type them into either the chat or the Q&A, and I will ask them so that Dr. Carlson can answer them live. And for those of you in the room, obviously, you will also be able to participate in the Q&A at the end too. So, without further ado, Dr. Carlson.
Hey, thank you very much. Well, guys, thanks for coming out here this evening here, enjoying some time checking out the Hay Camp Brewery here. It's very, very good here. So today, guys, we're going to talk about critical materials, kind of the ethical, strategic, and technological perspectives. As they said, I'm Brett Carlson. I'm an assistant professor down at the South Dakota Mines, Materials and Metallurgical Engineering Department. And just kind of as a way of background, what are we going to talk about today? We're going to kind of talk about a bit of an overview of what a critical material is, how does a material become critical, and what are some of the paths we can see looking forward. So, a critical material. End of the day, guys, right? Geology is a game of chance, essentially. So the production of minerals not evenly distributed throughout the different countries. Some countries will produce more and different minerals and materials than others. And here's just kind of a quick breakdown, kind of interesting way to look at it, of different countries and their share of the periodic table on the right. So you can see China has a good chunk of stuff mixed out there. We can see Democratic Republic of Congo has a fair amount of cobalt and tantalum. You can see Russia there has a share of a number of things, South Africa, things like that. We can see there's a distribution, right, of materials. And it's not even, end of the day. And so what does that mean for here in the US? So that means that there are a number of minerals which we're going to have to rely on from other countries. And here's just a quick breakdown here. We can see we're in the US. Number of commodities that we're greater than 50% reliant on is in dark red here. We can see Canada. We're reliant on Canada for a lot of different materials. Brazil, Mexico, maybe less so than some places in Europe. And then in dark red over there, we have China and Australia over there in a bit lighter shade. And here's just kind of a breakdown of what that kind of slide is talking about here. This is just a look at 2019 numbers, net import reliance for different materials. And this is commodities. This is one part of a much bigger chart that you can't see too well on a PowerPoint. So I snipped off the top of it, which is the most important part. We can see commodities here. For example, fluorspar, that's calcium fluoride, right? We're 100% reliant on fluorspar, and we're getting almost all of that from Mexico. Well, that's okay. It's not so bad, I guess, all things considered. And that gets to a point where we're kind of delineate between people often talk about critical minerals, critical metals, critical materials. We're going to use the latter term here because it can encompass a lot more different things, right? A mineral, right, can be things like, in this case, fluorspar, that's calcium fluoride. Whereas a metal, right, we're talking about calcium metal or praseodymium metal. So we'll be using critical materials as the overarching term here. Overall, though, what makes a mineral or material critical, right? Net import reliance is an important factor. All right, how much we rely on other countries to bring that material in, but it's not the only thing to consider. So there's a couple different definitions depending on who you talk to. We're going to use kind of the USGS as our basis for what we're going to call a critical material, essentially, right? So there's a couple factors that go into it. End of the day, though, a critical material performs a critical function without any easy substitutes, and there's a chance that supply can be disrupted. And the higher those two are, the more critical the material is, right? And so the USGS puts another side of things into it. They talk about disruption potential, right? What would happen if that supply of material is disrupted? The trade exposure side of it, that's how much we produce in the US versus we import from the rest of the world. And the economic vulnerability, how big a deal would it be economically if those minerals were to be cut off? And once again, you can look at this from different perspectives, right? The Department of Energy will have their own perspectives on things. The Department of Defense will have another. End of the day, it kind of depends on who you're asking. Today, we're going to be talking kind of like a US economic perspective in general. So you take some of these ideas, like things like supply risk, and folks have taken a lot of time and investigated what constitutes supply risk, you know, kind of taking into effect things like geopolitical issues, as well as issues with, let's say, government stability in different parts of the world. And they've tried to map out kind of a heat map, so to speak, of supply risk. And that's what we see here. So we can see, this is once again, the most risky elements, the most critical elements here. We can see things like dysprosium, neodymium, lanthanum, those are part of the rare earths, which we'll be talking about here a bit more. And we can see supply risk once again through time, 2007 to 2016 in this section here. And this heat map, essentially dark red, is being means it has a higher supply risk, right? And you can see that one trend is that supply risk changes over time. Different geopolitical events happen, and things that weren't so risky before become riskier, and vice versa. And this is just a quick breakdown of where we get some of these top risky things. You can see a theme here, which we'll be touching on later on. There's a certain country that will be making an appearance, and then what they're used for. So rare earths, we can talk about neodymium and dysprosium. The most important use of those are permanent magnets. We can also look at things like cobalt. Super alloys are important use of cobalt, but I would argue more important going forward are going to be things like lithium-ion batteries, the use of cobalt. And that gets to the point that these things change over time. So we have all these different factors, right? We have economic vulnerability, we have supply risk, and we have trade exposure. We can map all these together as a way to try to understand what's critical, what isn't. And this is what we're doing here. So we have economic vulnerability, one being really, really important to the economy. Disruption potential, one being really likely that if this happens, that it's going to cause ripples throughout the economy. And trade exposure here are as one being entirely dependent on somebody else, and zero being it's all produced internally. So we have some things like iron ore, right? Iron ore is up here. Iron ore is very, very important to the US economy. Steel is the backbone of our infrastructure. But we produce a good amount of steel here. We have a good amount of iron ore being produced in the US. So the disruption potential is pretty low. So it's high economic vulnerability, but a low disruption potential. You couple that with things like, well, let's compare that to some of the rare earths, which make a high spot in this graph here. We have neodymium right here. That has a fairly high economic vulnerability and it has a high disruption potential. So those two things together push neodymium and most of the rest of the rare earths into what's called a critical material, right? Once again, the idea is right, it's important for the economy and we don't have very much of it produced here. And there's a likelihood that the supply could be disrupted. Those three things together form what's called a critical mineral. And so we've been talking about the rare earths. We're not going to spend too much time on these because they've been a subject of a lot of talks recently. But they're a good case study in what a critical material is and how that can evolve over time. So the rare earths, right, called the lanthanides, they're at the bottom of the periodic table there, right? They're really important for things like different LED lamp phosphors, or most importantly, I think, rare earth magnets, neodymium, dysprosium, those guys, for making those really small, powerful magnets we use in things like hard drives, as well as the electric motors for cars, or the wind generation capacity of wind turbines in their power generators. Rare earths, you can kind of look back over time, production kilotons. This is a bit of an older graph, but it's still helpful, I think. So there was a time the US, mostly out of the Mountain Pass mine in China, in California, was the dominant producer of rare earths. Most of the world's rare earths came from Mountain Pass out there in California. At the time, the big consumer was europium for color TVs. But we can see that around 1985, 1990, that Mountain Pass mine starts to decrease production for several reasons. And in turn, China, who was then awakening from their, I guess, slumber from economic activity and rejoining the World Economic Forum here, was starting to ramp up production. And China then became the dominant producer of rare earths in the world. And this graph kind of continues on. There's been some undulations back and forth, but that is still the case. And that's just kind of an example of how these issues of critical minerals evolve over time. If you ask somebody in 1985, are rare earths a critical mineral? Their answer was going to be no, because we are more or less self-reliant and produce most of what we need here. That answer is now a yes, right? Those things change over time. And to that end, I kind of wanted to focus today on kind of case studies on looking forward to the future. What are going to be the critical materials going forward? The rare earths are certainly our current one, but what things are going to be important in the future? And one thing that comes to mind are battery materials. People are talking about electric cars a lot, right? And the fact is, if we're going to have this large mass scale electrification of the transportation sector and other sectors, right? We're going to need a lot of batteries. And so this is just a projection of gigawatt hours batteries in the market over time. And we can see this was produced, I think, around 2019. So we're about here currently, but in short order, in the next couple of years, we're going to see a very, very, very large demand for batteries. They're going to become more and more important as more vehicles become electrified. And it's going to become a very, very important commodity. So what does this current supply chain look like for batteries? So this is an interesting one to look at, lithium-ion battery production. We can see once again the domination of China taking place in this sector. So this is capacity for battery production by region over time. This study was made in 2018, so not too long ago. We can see that 221 gigawatt hours world production capacity was there, of which 135 was based in China. But there was also production in the US, Europe, and Asia, some production. We can see going forward that it's predicted that the relative share of production will be kind of similar to what we've seen in the past, the result of which that China will be the largest producer of batteries. They have positioned themselves very, very well in the lithium-ion battery supply chain, despite the fact that they are not a big producer of the battery metals needed for lithium-ion batteries, which we'll kind of look into really quickly here. So what do you need to make lithium-ion batteries, right? Well, lithium comes to mind. You need lithium to make that work. But there are other sides of the cell, so to speak. Your cathode material that is made up of these mixed metal oxides, right? So lithium cobalt oxide was the biggest one to start with. This is this top one here, but it doesn't show up too well here. But we can see in red here, this big red, dark red chunk. This is what's known as the lithium nickel manganese cobalt oxide, is now and going to become even more so the more dominant cathode chemistry in lithium-ion batteries. And you can see a couple interesting metals if you look at this, right? We have lithium, which we expected. We have nickel, we have manganese, and we have cobalt, right? So all these what's called battery metals going forward are going to be more and more important. So let's look at kind of just to take a look at where those materials come from. Well, first of all, look at lithium here, right? So as electrification intensifies, we're going to see a big demand for lithium-ion batteries. No surprise here that is pushing the demand for lithium way up. So these are 2010 numbers. There's about 23,000 ton was the lithium production capacity. And this is world capacity, right? Now we're here about 10 years later. We can see that the production demand, the production of lithium is now 93,000 tons per annum. So that has gone up almost 4 times in the last 10 years. So it has a huge increase in capacity. And the main driver of that, we can see, this is an interesting graph here, we can see the different uses for lithium. Of course, there's ceramics and glasses, it's important component glasses. There's things like lithium grease, right? That's an important one, you can see that. that produces some, has some demand for lithium. But 10 years ago, batteries didn't make up more than a quarter of the demand for lithium ion, for lithium metal or lithium in general. But we can see that is not the case anymore. Batteries are now far and away the biggest end use of lithium. And that is just going to keep on going, become a further and further bigger wedge in the lithium market as we go forward. So currently, just kind of speaking in general, right, lithium is produced by a few different places. I can just speak to it in broad terms here. There's lithium brines. That is more or less lithium in dissolved water. That's produced mostly in the Atacama region in South America. That's these dry, flat lake beds, right? Where if you dig underground, it hits salt water pretty quickly underneath the dry salt lake beds. And those contain a fair amount of lithium salts. So those are pumped out of the ground and separated via evaporation ponds, and eventually you can form a pretty good lithium carbonate out of those. And that's made, once again, kind of what's called the lithium triangle, and the Atacama, Chile, Argentina, and Bolivia. And more nowadays, this demand is being met by Australia, who produces a hard rock lithium from different spodumene deposits out in Western Australia. So these two make up the lion's share of lithium production. South America and Australia, both of which are fairly open to trade and fairly friendly nations. But we still see this. This is a lithium carbonate price, and this is an RMB, that's Chinese currency per ton. This, in general, this demand for lithium has, of course, caused a big increase in price. And you can see, just as this is just a one-year graph, that lithium has been fairly stable for a very long time, has some ups and downs, but the last year has seen a tremendous increase in the price of lithium. And most of that's due to, some, of course, to general issues with commodity prices in the last year or two, but also that's coupled to the real demand for lithium-ion batteries. So that's one part, right, of lithium-ion batteries is lithium production, right? And we're going to transition to one of the other big battery metals here, and that's cobalt. So when I say the DRC, that's the Democratic Republic of the Congo, right, in Central Africa. So the DRC, through fate, has the world's largest and richest reserves of cobalt, far and away. And they are responsible for most of the world's cobalt production. Here's can't quite see from the back, I know, but this big red piece of pie here, that is the DRC's production of cobalt, of cobalt in the world, essentially. In 2018, you can see they are the dominant producer. The U.S. does, so this is a quick breakdown from the U.S. here. There is other places that produce cobalt. The U.S. produces a little, Canada produces some, Australia produces some, but once again, Congo is the DRC is the largest producer, far and away. But you'll notice that the DRC isn't known as the battery manufacturing hub, just as South America and Australia aren't the battery manufacturing hubs as well. So this kind of goes into, once again, I'm bringing up China's involvement in the cobalt industry. Though not a large producer, China is a major player in refining cobalt. So once you dig it, out of the ground, right, there's several steps to it being refined into a material which you can use in a battery, right? And they have, through smart supply chain production, become the dominant refiner of cobalt. And we can see here in this little graph here. So this gray here at the bottom, this is rest of world production, mine production, intermediate capacity, and refinery capacity. Intermediate is just a concentrate which you ship to a refiner, essentially, right? And we can see that the rest of the world, most of the cobalt, right, is not coming from China, mine production-wise, though that there is a growing share that is made by Chinese-owned mines in the DRC. That's this top share, and that has actually grown a fair bit since this graph was made. But downstream, the refinery capacity, where the cobalt is actually going in today, is dominated by Chinese domestic production. Chinese production, they're the guys that if you mine cobalt, you need to sell it to somebody. End of the day, it's probably going to a Chinese refiner. So what does this mean, right? So this is kind of an interesting take on critical minerals with regards to batteries, right? So China not being a dominant producer of any particular battery metal, not nickel or cobalt or lithium, they produce some, of course, but they're not the dominant, have positioned themselves in such a way that they have a control of the supply chain. If you're making lithium carbonate, you got to sell it to somebody to make a battery. If you're making cobalt concentrate, you got to sell it to somebody. And China is the buyers. And so by having that refinery capacity, they can then have a good foothold into the end use, right, which is lithium ion batteries. And by controlling that supply chain, almost from start to end, right, you have a good amount of control over lithium ion batteries, which is just smart practice, really, because they have a set supply of these materials for their own domestic production of batteries for their electrification. I just want to take a side note here, guys, on one thing that's come up in the last few months. Another battery metal is nickel, right? You can see that in some of those chemistries that manganese, nickel, cobalt oxide, right? And so there's been recently a very large spike in the nickel price. This is a nickel price, I think RMB per ton over time. And just at the end of 2022, we saw this ridiculously big spike in nickel prices. And that was due to a few things. It's interesting. This kind of gets into the geopolitics of critical materials, right? You're sensitive to supply shocks, and whether those supply shocks are caused by kind of geopolitical brinkmanship or war are both real possibilities. So there was a nickel produced, nickel was produced fairly widely, throughout the world. Canada is a big producer of nickel. Australia, the Philippines are a big producer of laterite deposits, but Russia is also a big producer. And so part of the ongoing Ukrainian issues there was a huge, there's a bit of a supply issue with nickel because of the Ukrainian war, which caused, this is a word that's kind of come in common parlance here since the GameStop, meme stock stuff I'm sure you guys have heard about. There was a short squeeze on nickel. There was a nickel supplier who had shorted nickel contracts because they wanted to hedge their bets, so to speak, on nickel prices. And then, the nickel price went up and they weren't able to fulfill their contracts. And we saw this huge spike in nickel, which is an interesting combination of geopolitics and economics coming together. So guys, this is just kind of a talk on what is the current state of play in lithium ion batteries, which is kind of just a small segment of what you could be called critical minerals, right, or critical materials. But I think it's an important one and a really good way to understand how the world supply chain systems work, right? Another one we can talk about here really quickly are tantalum and niobium minerals. So these are two minerals called tantalite and clumbite, which are the tantalum-rich end member and the niobium-rich end member of the same mineral, essentially. And collectively, these are called Coldhand. You'll see this word being about Coldhand. That just means it's a kind of a shortened clumbite tantalite concentrate. So tantalum is an essential component in not semiconductors, some of that, but also capacitors, high-end capacitors, which are used in electronics. So they're very important to the modern electronics market here. And just looking at their global production over time, this is just a graphic that most of you know here. Back in the day, this is once again kind of looking at history of production for a certain mineral, and this is in particular tantalum. We can see that before 2000, this blue here, this is Australian production. And Australia was the dominant producer of tantalum and coltan, mostly through byproducts of some of their mines, some of their hard rock pegmatite mines. But through some issues with politics, mine life, and issues like that, the Greenbrush mine in Australia started winding down their production around the time of the economic fallout of 2008. And in response, most of that coltan production, even before in the early 2000s into 2008, most of that difference in supply was taken up by Central Africa, who has the same sort of pegmatite deposits as Australia. I know I can just speak really briefly here to coltan itself. Coltan, guys, is a very dense black mineral. It's very easy to concentrate it just through simple gravity separation. You can think back to the folks around the gold rush around here, right? All you need is a sluice or something like that. You can pan Coldhand out. It doesn't take very much for advanced tools or anything like that. You can be making a pretty good Coldhand concentrate pretty quickly. And because it was so easy to mine, and there was a good value to it, it ended up taking part in several different conflicts in the Central Africa. During the 1998 to 2003, there was a large-scale war in the DRC and surrounding areas, right? It's called the Second Congo War or the African World War in some places. And you had a large amount of these rebel groups spread throughout different parts of, remote DRC, Rwanda, places like that, who were in need of funding. And so, partially to fund themselves, they started producing tantalum from these open pit mines, which can be produced, once again, very easily. Doesn't take much for fancy mechanized equipment. If you have somebody to work there, you can get it done. So these rebel groups who committed a lot of atrocities in the Second Congo War were partially funded by coltan mining, and that has led to coltan being labeled as a conflict mineral, right? So because it's funded a lot of these rebel groups and a lot of atrocities have been funded by coltan, and so it's received a lot of scrutiny over the last few years, right? How do we make sure the coltan we're buying isn't coming from these conflict zones? So this led to status as conflict mineral inclusion to the Dodd-Frank Act. The Dodd-Frank Act, mostly from the fallout of the financial crisis in 2008, but it also included provisions for things like conflict minerals to make sure companies weren't funding extremist groups, right? So there's a big question, which is an ongoing question. How do we figure out where this mineral is coming from? And it's an ongoing bit of research we have going on at the Materials and Metallurgical Engineering Department, along with Dr. Keller in the back there and Sam Kessinger. How do we try and track and trace this coltan from where it's being produced in a mine to where it's being bought up by somebody, a refiner in Belgium or someplace like that, who then sells it off to Apple to make an iPhone? How do you try and make sure that the coltan and the tantalum you're buying isn't getting mixed around with tantalum from a place you don't want it to be from? And that gets onto kind of this nexus of critical minerals and conflict minerals, which I think is an interesting point to look at. The same sort of issues can arise from, on a humanitarian perspective, from the production of things like cobalt. So cobalt, once again, is mined in the DRC. A lot of these open pit mines are by established mining companies, established large mining companies. But some aren't. There is a large amount of artisanal cobalt mining that occurs, and there are human rights abuses that are affiliated with those artisanal small-scale mining sometimes. And so there's a push to try and figure out how can you track and trace cobalt, which is not an easy thing to do. Once it gets intermingled with different concentrates, it's hard to say whether it came from this mine or this mine. So that's an ongoing big bit of research as well. So that's another aspect to the critical materials side of it is the humanitarian and conflict minerals issues surrounded by that. So those are just a couple things to think about here. But what I wanted to spend some time talking about now is, well, we've seen where we are and where we've been. Where are we going to go forward? Where do we go from here, essentially, right? So the last 10 years or so, there's been a very large interest in critical minerals and materials, right? It's kind of come to the forefront of things like newspaper articles. You hear about it coming a lot. And the last 10 years, it's been mostly on the rare earths, but there's a lot of other important critical minerals. And obviously, right, the events of the last few years have really shed a light on issues with supply chains. We can see how fragile some of these supply chains we built are, right? We have a globalized world, and that's not going to go away, right? We depend on different countries to make different products. That's part and parcel to globalization. But because of that, we have these long supply chains back and forth. Cobalt mined in the DRC is going to be refined in Belgium before it's being shipped to China to be produced into a lithium-ion battery, and then it's being sent out into a Nissan to Japan and put to a Nissan Leaf, and that's being sold to the US. We have these interwoven supply chains. And how do we address this issue of critical materials in this sphere, right? So because of all these issues the last couple of years, it's become much more apparent that there's problems. You can see price spikes ongoing, right? So there's recently there's been an announcement that the Defense Production Act has been enacted for the supply of 5 certain critical minerals for electrical energy generation. That's lithium, cobalt, graphite, nickel, and manganese. Those are all things you need to make a lithium-ion battery, right? So the question is, there's the political will, right, to do something about it, right? So how do we address this? There's a few different ways we could go about it, right? We could try and address it by ramping up US production, and that's a feasible thing in some ways. We have some really great, for example, not these materials in general, but we have some really great rare earth mines in the US. We have formerly Molycorp Mountain Pass mine in California. We have a number of really good occurrences, even in the region, right? We have the Barrel Lodge deposit just up north here. That's a really good rare earth project. There's a number of other ones around the US. And just to speak to that for a moment, I guess, right? We have this big, we have these deposits, right? They're very good deposits. But there is still the issues with things like supply chains. So if we produce a rare earth concentrate, let's say out of Mountain Pass, right? Pretty good neodymium, good praseodymium levels, pretty saleable. We want to make magnets out of it, right? We're going to try and make rare earth magnets to power electric cars and hard drives and wind turbines. But there is no magnet production in the US, essentially. So you have this rare earth concentrate, you mine it here. And you want an end product, right? And you're left with no other option right now but to ship it to the guys who are making the magnets, which is China, once again. So you have this US production, but once again, you're ultimately reliant on an outside entity for making magnets, and one that maybe doesn't always have seen eye to eye on things, which kind of gets into what's called as supply risk side, right? So that's the rare earths, right? But there are things that the US doesn't have great deposits for, things like cobalt, nickel, not so great either. So how do we get these materials we need, like cobalt and graphite and lithium to get sent as well, without having this critical mineral status, right? One aspect is maybe we try and develop better relationships with maybe become more friendly countries, right? Australia has a big production of lithium. Maybe there's better relationships that could be brought up in Australia. For example, this is another option here. Another thing. Mount Weld is a really big Australian rare earth mine. They are now partnering with several companies in the US for producing rare earth separations and actually making rare earth metals in the US through one of these, I think it's partially funded by the Department of Energy, through a couple different companies in the US for producing, extracting and separating the different rare earths. Another option is, right, how do we combine these two things to make supply chains more resilient, right? How do we make it so we're not relying on one mine to produce all of the things we need? And that is not really a simple question, not a simple question to answer here. There's lots of different facets going on. There's lots of different possible ways we can try and address this problem. And it's not to solve the question. There's task force going on right now trying to figure out, well, what do we do about cobalt? What are we going to do about tantalum? It's it's an ongoing bit of research, right? And it always will be. As we saw before, that the production of these minerals are in flux. The story, 20, 30 years ago for rare earths is much different than the story it is now. The story for nickel mining was much different 20 years ago than it is now. And, probably 20 years in the future, the story is going to look a lot different. And so there's always going to be this kind of need for a dynamic change in trying to and trying to handle these issues with supply. And I think that brings up an interesting point, kind of looking backwards even farther, right? Critical minerals aren't a new idea, right? We've always needed things for different things. And one kind of cool local thing is that the Black Hills with their pegmatite deposits were once a very important source for critical materials. For example, back in the day, lithium grease was a new high temperature grease, and it was essential for aircraft components and aircraft engines. So to make B-17s for the war, in World War II, right, we needed lithium really badly. And as a response, a large amount of lithium was produced in just here in the Black Hills. So this is a picture of the Etta mine, which is a big lithium producer up near Keystone back in the day. And they actually hold the, at the time, I think it might still be, the world record for largest crystal ever found. There's a giant crystal spodumene, which is a lithium ore, a lithium crystal found at the Etta mine, called them spodumene logs, giant essentially crystals of lithium that can be dug out by hand, essentially. Whereas nowadays, right, it takes a lot of mineral processing to make a spodumene concentrate. Back then, you could just take it out of the ground as a big old crystal of spodumene. But it was also an important source. The Black Hills were important for production of beryllium until not too long ago. Beryllium was an important thing for things like phosphorus back in the day. Tantalum was an important thing produced in the U.S. pegmatite deposits, as well as things like feldspars and micas and things like that. And I think it's an interesting way to look back on what has been done and what it's to kind of guide what can be done in the future. And one thing I'll talk about here briefly here is other ways we can try and produce these critical minerals, right? And maybe that's looking at things in a different way, looking at non-traditional sources of things. And one source of those things are for manganese is the what's called the Owakoma manganese nodules. So you guys may have heard of sea nodules, right? In the last 10 years, once again, they're becoming pretty popular. People talking about ocean floor mining, right? There are these incrustations of manganese and different minerals sitting at the bottom of the seafloor. The ones on the seafloor now have things like nickel and cobalt and copper in them. It's the main guys. They're formed over millions of years just by slow deposition of metal from seawater. Well, an interesting side note that about 60 million years ago, I might have those dates wrong. Yeah, I'm the talking geologist here. The inland, most of South Dakota was the bottom of a shallow inland sea. And so the same things that were occurring now, there's these precipitations of these manganese sea nodules, were happening then. And so you had the bottom of these really big inland oceans. You had the deposition of these sea nodules, slowly precipitating out over thousands of years. We'll fast forward to about now, when we have those sea nodules, which once were the bottom of the ocean, are now on the surface. And they happen to be on the surface near Owakoma in Chamberlain, the center of the state in South Dakota. So I actually have a couple in the back there if you wanted to go check them out. More or less, if you're walking around the Owakoma area, you can just see big, on the sides of the hills, just essentially a couple of hills are more or less black with, they kind of stand out. It seems kind of strange as you're driving around I-90. And if you walk up there, they're covered in these nodules, these essentially black accretions of manganese from the bottom of the ocean from back in the day. They're just on the surface. Now you can walk around and pick them up, and they're just hanging out. And so this attracted a lot of attention back in World War II. Once again, we had a big need for manganese. Manganese is an essential component for steel. You need it, you need a lot of it. It's also going to be a very important part for lithium manganese batteries going forward. But in World War II, it was recognized that this is an important resource. Maybe we should look at it in case we need it, in case we can't make manganese here. So they built a pilot plant out near Chamberlain in Owakoma. You can actually see the remains of it back in the day, just west of the river. If you're driving east on I-90, if you look to your left, you can see a couple of brick structures, the remains of an old shaft that are still there from the old pilot plant that the U.S. Mines built in the 40s to produce this manganese. At the time, it was economically challenging to make work, but because of its criticality, it was still tried, and that can be seen today. Once again, this deposit, who's been They've explored it further. They started to look around, trying to figure out how big it was. J.P. Bryce, who's a big guy in the geology department here at South Dakota Mines back in the day, was responsible for a lot of the exploration. And he had an estimate for just around the Oklahoma area that he had a ballpark figure. It was a great ballpark, he wasn't quite sure, but of around 800 million tons of manganese contained just in the area there, which accounts to around 1,000 years supply of manganese at current levels. So it's a tremendous possible source of manganese, but the low grade and some of the challenging techniques that are involved in mining these deposits make it so it's hard to approach it kind of as things are now. So one bit of research we have going on currently is on these manganese nodules and looking at different types of processing techniques that they might not have had back in the 40s. Things like bioleaching, using bacteria to help us leach out the manganese content, and other different non-traditional leaching techniques is a bit of research we have ongoing. And well, with any luck, we can maybe make this manganese here, because once again, manganese was a critical component back in the 40s. The US doesn't have much production. That's forward here to now. The US has no production of manganese, even though it's an essential component for steel and will become increasingly more important for lithium-ion batteries. It's a critical mineral because we don't produce much of it here, and it could pretty easily be disrupted. So guys, that was just kind of a good example of where we are now, where we've been, and where we could be going in the future. And with that, I'll answer any questions. Thank you so much, guys. Any questions from here? Oh, yeah, please.
Recently, like in the last 3 or 4 years, I've heard some talk of rare earth mine minerals we proposed near Sundance. I don't know what the current status of that is. That very much like
Oh yeah, so that is the barrelized deposit which I mentioned earlier is the mine near Sundance. It's changed hands a few times. I'll disclaim here, I don't own any stock. I don't own any stock in any company or anything like that. It was a company called Rare Element Resources, which are still around, who was doing a lot of drilling up there. They got bought out by a company called, I think, General Atomics, who is still interested in the deposit. And so they've been not doing as much drilling anymore. They have the deposit kind of mapped out, but they've been working with the Department of Energy on building a pilot plant. So there's actually plans now to build not pilot, but a demonstration plant for their proprietary extraction technique. I think near Upton, I think it is. So it's a ways off, but there's still some definitely some interest in that deposit up there. And rare earth prices are 2 or 3 times what they were 10 years ago. So there's a possibility it could happen. Once again, it's going to be a while, but there definitely is some interest there. Yeah.
Sorry, there's a lot of manganese associated with that deposit as well. Public sector.
Yeah.
Which one is the major? Which one are we?
I remember. I think, and I wasn't around for that, but I believe there's some folks from the metallurgy department. I think when they were starting to develop and stuff, did some solvent extraction for manganese from those deposits. I think Kelsey Fitzgerald, he's around here. I don't know if he came today. Did some work with that. And yeah, I haven't heard too much about their plans for secondary recovery, but there's going to be, if they're leaching the rare earths, they're going to be leaching manganese too. They're going to need to do something with it. So that could be a great resource as well. Yeah, I haven't heard what their plan is, but that's a really good point. Oh,
with the need for lithium and all the other materials for batteries, and how much we're expecting to use those and create all that type of thing. We know there's finite amounts of material on Earth, right?
Yeah.
And if some of these are harder to leach off of, cost effective, are there plans to look at other substitute type of materials to produce batteries rather than lithium? Or?
That's a great question, and that's something I really didn't talk too much about it in the talk there. So that's it. We have all these lithium-ion batteries producing. We don't have any lithium production in the U.S. really. what's a low hanging fruit for producing these metals? Well, we have the batteries already. So one thing to look into is battery recycling as an alternative possible source for lithium, as well as the other battery metals, cobalt, nickel. So there's a huge amount of work being done, both at Carlson Mines, so guys, both at South Dakota Mines, as well as in industry, for looking at lithium-ion battery recycling, for recovering things like lithium, cobalt, and nickel, the battery metals, or reconditioning batteries for a second life. And I think that's going to be an increasingly important aspect for production for batteries. I can just take a step back here, looking at things like that have been in production a long time, things like steel, right? The U.S. has a very robust recycling system for steel, right? So we produce most of our new steel coming off the line is recycled steel. But we still need some primary production. We still have some iron ore production, but we still have some primary iron production. And I imagine that might be the case going forward. You're going to have that sort of case, maybe the case with lithium-ion batteries. Whenever there's a growth, a growth market, recycling can't take all that up, right? Because it's just a matter of mass balance, right? There's only so much lithium-ion batteries, lithium in the batteries you have, and need more lithium. That needs to come from somewhere, but they can provide a very excellent stopgap for secondary production, especially in places like the US, which doesn't have a lot of battery metal production. Recycling is a good secondary source. And the other aspect of it is kind of the non-traditional sources, right? So there's a number of places in, I think, Nevada and Idaho, even looking at non-traditional lithium ores, hard rock ores, and alluvial ores, things like hectorite, and trying to produce lithium from geothermal brines and things like that, which are maybe 10 years ago were a bit up in the air, but with the increased demand and the increased prices of lithium, maybe it makes sense. That's kind of another avenues, the secondary sources, along with we talked about the manganese C nodules, so kind of an alternative ore source. That's a really good question. Thank you. Oh yeah.
Just want to mention too that there's that Cobalt belt. It's already known they're going to start one of the mines.
Yeah, I've heard from those guys up in Idaho. That's going to be, there's the Eagle mine, which produces some cobalt in the UP. Yeah.
Eagle, that's up.
Yeah, that's up in the UP. But yeah, the one in northern Idaho is going to be an important one going forward. And the U.S. does have some production as well, secondary production, I should say, from the folks up at Stillwater produces some nickel there as part of their as a byproduct from their platinum group mine. And there are some nickel production and other battery production in the U.S. as well. I'm really interested to see what happens with that one up in Idaho. Sounds pretty cool. Oh yeah, sorry. Go ahead. Yeah.
Is the Mountain Pass mine supposed to be ramping up production after?
Yeah, they right. Yeah, where they are right now, I'm not 100% sure. They had the Molycorp version 2, right, was ramping up about 10 years ago. Well, 2008, 2010, right? They started production. They started doing some good work re-mining material, and then the rare earth prices collapsed, and Molycorp went under about 2000. I think it was 2012. And that rare earth price collapse could be in part due to market manipulation, you could say, from China, who produces most of the rare earths, can control the price due to vendors. But the new guys on the block, so to speak, are MP Materials. Yeah, MP Materials out in Mountain Pass, who have been looking at restart. They have essentially restarted Molycorp's operation there. They've been doing a lot of, my understanding at last I heard, they were producing a rare earth concentrate that they were shipping out to both China and refineries in Estonia. There are some non-Chinese refiners, so the main one being out in Eastern Europe and Estonia. And I think the plan is to restart their rare earth separation plant as well. I'm not sure exactly where they are, but MP Materials is producing rare earths there. And that's a very interesting one because they're primarily U.S. owned. They essentially bought out Molycorp's facility once they went under. But they do have a minority stakeholder that is a Chinese-based minority stakeholder, which is an interesting bit going on there. And they are right now producing just kind of a general, I think, right now makes concentrate, which they're selling off. But there are plans, I think, to work with, well, I can't remember exactly. I think it's a DOE program for producing rare earths, metals, and there's an end product actually in the US. So that's an ongoing project for sure. Yeah, sure. Sorry. Oh, okay, yeah. Oh, the Texas guys, the Round Mountain.
Yeah, they have partnership with Colorado, because it's gonna be mining and other stuff, so they're like a launch of going.
Yeah.
Maybe this will work out there.
Yeah, I've heard about those guys a little bit. I know they have some partnerships with some universities, and I'm not sure if it was New Mexico or it was one I think it was University in Texas, and it was the Round Mountain or something to that effect. Yeah, it was a very very large polymetallic, low-grade polymetallic deposit. They had lithium and then rare earths and a couple other things. But I'm not. Yeah, that's right. I've only heard about some of their stuff secondhand, essentially. I haven't been involved with the project for any cases, but it's a huge. I do remember hearing it's a very, very large deposit of low grade, but heavy in the high value heavy rares. The right cycle lanthanides, things like dysprosium, terbium, those high value components. So I don't know exactly where they are, but that's another ongoing project. Yeah, then there's those guys, and then I think there's another mine in Nebraska that's looking to do some things, and a couple other places here and there. So there are some. Well, actually, I think I might have a let's see if I can get to it. Here we are. This is just a breakdown of current rare earth deposits, and we can see that. So big squares are producing mines. Here's Mountain Pass. But we do have a number of deposits in the U.S. We have the guys up in Bear Lodge here. We have 13. I think that is the. Oh yeah, this is a different name. The one I remember, Pino Mountain, down in Texas. Some of those mountains down there. There's a number of prospects or ongoing projects in the U.S. So they're out there. The U.S. has some good rare earth deposits for sure. Yeah.
Talk about the education skill sets that are used in this.
That's a really good question, and I think maybe one near and dear to our hearts at South Dakota Mines, right? So to produce anything, right, you'll need a number of specialists, right? You'll need geologists that are good at doing exploration geology. You'll need mining engineers, right, who can do the mining engineering. You'll need metallurgists, which I guess I'm a bit biased towards, who can do the extraction and the refining, right? And that, along with, well, even downstream, right? You need things like people, mechanical engineers who are adept in production techniques for things like lithium-ion batteries or rare earth magnets. You'll need the whole supply chain essentially, right? And so you'll need, if you want to have production in the U.S., you'll need a lot of workforce development to make that happen. You'll need specialists. You'll need people trained in these very niche industries, right? And I think, sadly, to a large part of the sense, right? There aren't many metallurgical engineering folks around here anymore, right? There's us and South Dakota Mines, Colorado Mines does a good job. Salt Lake City, Missouri does a great job too. But there's only a couple of schools around there that are producing extractive metallurgists and chemical metallurgists. And there's a big role to fill if you're going to try and ship some of this, I guess, industrial capacity back to the U.S. So it'll take training a lot of metallurgists, a lot of mining engineers, a lot of geologists to make this domestic production happen. And that's going to be an uphill battle pretty well. And some of that could involve, we talked about different challenges, things like that. But I think that reinvesting into metal production is a big subject for sure. And it'll take some time, I think. Yeah.
Are those students
well, maybe right there, wrongly so. That's probably the case. You know, that mining has a bit of a a bad rap through, people look at past issues with mining, which frankly so, you can see environmental pollution. But I don't think that's very well representative of what mining is and what extractive metallurgy is currently, right? You can look at modern mining techniques, modern reclamation techniques, which are bar none, can more or less bring back something to where it was prior to mining, and sometimes better.
Well, two things, I just, picture of the,
Mhm.
Your loves.
Yeah.
And I did go to the courses, with the representative from, years ago, something like that, and we asked what their reclamation plan was. And I didn't,
I don't know.
zero.
Well, that's not a good place to be. Yeah.
So there are concerns there.
Well, I think, and those are rightly so. You can see things that have happened in the past. I think one aspect to focus on as an educator, right, and get people interested in things, is things like looking at what you can call urban mining and recycling, because the same extractive metallurgy techniques and tools that have been developed for extracting. Once again, this is just looking on an extractive metallurgist point of view, looking at things like producing lithium from a mineral like spodumene can be applied to producing lithium from a feedstock like lithium-ion batteries. So at the end of the day, you're going to need that specialization in extractive metallurgy and chemical metallurgy to produce materials, whether that's from a primary source or a secondary source. And I think that is probably one part to definitely include in on things like when you're developing curriculum and things like that, including that focus and that issues on recycling, I think is an important aspect to it. I try to do that. I'm teaching hydrometallurgy at South Dakota Mines this year. So I'm both talking about leaching of copper from low-grade heap leaching deposit, but also talking about recycling of copper via ammonia pressure leaching, right? So those things are, I think, in the public's mind, divorced from each other. But in reality, they're part and parcel of the same thing. If you go to, I used to work at a lead acid battery recycling plant. The guys doing the recycling are extractive metallurgists. They're the guys who are trained in extracting metals from ores. They're the guys who are going to be producing metals from batteries, right? Those two things are intertwined. I know I'm sure there's going to be a lot of things to overcome. There's always going to have to be a balance between balance of societal needs, right? End of the day, we have this large need for producing lithium-ion batteries, right? The current feedstock for lithium batteries are not going to be near enough, even at 100% recycling, to make up for the demand for electric vehicles, right? So that material is going to have to come from somewhere, and the somewhere is going to be mining. End of the day, it's going to come from mining. And I guess one aspect you could look at from a domestic perspective, right? The U.S. has better environmental controls and better environmental practices than other places that are mining these materials, and better humanitarian perspectives. For example, cobalt mining in the DRC versus cobalt mining in Idaho, right? There's a lot of humanitarian side of things to take into account as well. And I think that's going to have to become, that will have to be put in balance, right? You can't have, you don't want to have long-lasting environmental damage, right? That's not going to be good for anybody as well, right? So you need to make sure that metals can be produced sustainably in the U.S. and safely. And I think that's going to take a few things, right? You could look at other models for people in other countries that have done well with that. You can look at modern production of metals from places like Australia and our great neighbors in North Canada, who have done a very good job, I think, on trying to find that balance between societal needs for materials and societal needs for having a good place to live, right? You don't want to have acid mine drainage in your drinking water, right? You don't want to have ecological problems. You don't want to have populations of wildlife go away, right? But you also need to have, if you want to accomplish that on the other side of it, you need to have probably some electrification occur. So you have to have this balance between between these things. And I think this kind of gets into part of it, that can be looked at. But we have a kind of on the regulation side of things. Regulation is an important part of mining, right? To make sure everybody's doing a good job and doing things correctly, right? And how do we make sure we can do that good job and do those proper regulations at the same time have mining be something that can be achievable, right? This is just kind of an aside here, right? So a new mine in the U.S. And say you find some exploration geologists out there that finds a wonderful cobalt deposit, world class. It's going to be at least 10 years before that deposit has a shovel in the ground. You can compare that to, I think, interesting, and it kind of just a food for thought thing. You can compare that to a place like Canada or Australia, who I would say have comparable or even better maybe environmental controls in the US. That instead of 10 years down the road, you're talking maybe 3 to 4 years. And maybe there's some lessons to be learned there with how policy, on the policy side, but how that can be put together better so you can have more US production of battery materials from a clean source, let's say, a clean cobalt source that you have that's up in Idaho compared to one that has all these environmental and humanitarian issues with cobalt, let's say, from the DRC. That's just me rambling a bit. I don't have the answers. I don't know, but we'll see.
I'd like to see the school line state what we, having that reclamation.
That would be,
I see the enthusiasm.
yeah, that'd be wonderful.
So,
Yeah.
I think that would be great for all of us.
I hope so too. Yeah. Thank you. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
So, related question, you talked about the refining stage for, like, say, magnet manufacturing.
Yeah.
There is beyond just China being very strategic and focused, and they have unique stimulating things. Are those also problematic dirty industries? Is there another reason why we're not doing it, or other than maybe we haven't channeled student talent that way? Are there other barriers?
There are some other reasons for, I guess, in magnet production in particular. So there are technology that has come. So going back right down the day, right, you're forming a rare earth oxide, right? So let's say neodymium oxide from all your refining stages, right? Then you have essentially you could call it a smelting technique where you make neodymium metal from it. And the old school method of doing it is with a fluoride flux, a fluoride salt, electrolysis salt processed with fluoride. And a byproduct of that is producing a lot of polyfluorinated compounds as an off gas, which we know more and more about as time goes on, are not very good at all. Things like dioxins as well as other things. So that is still the dominant production technique in places like Eastern Asia. And so you have kind of lower cost, possibly more polluting techniques in existence there. And that has.
Like the offshore, it's not just for the labor, it's because of the mess you create.
Yeah, no, that's a real interesting question. Now, there are some there's some domestic techniques. I know there's a number of really good companies out in Boston area, Boston Metals. I can't think of some other companies right now who have developed a lot better electrolysis techniques, who are kind of coming on the market now. They produce a lot less. I think they're chloride-based systems. They're a lot cleaner, a lot more environmentally friendly. And the idea is hopefully they'll soon displace some of this older technology. Who can, and part of that is going to be both the environmental cost and the regulatory cost of it, right? But I think as technology improves, maybe it'll become a non-issue. I think those some of those more modern chloride-based cells will be able to produce things at cost. as the old chloride-based cells and do it cheaper. Maybe that technological innovation aspect, maybe can plug the hole of the environmental issues, is a hope, I think. And maybe that'll be, with any luck, that'll be what the future will look. You'll have a lot cleaner production onshore than you can have it offshore. And hopefully that cost will be at a parity. Still figuring that out, I guess. Yeah.
So, previous question on the ecological side.
Yeah.
Part of the curriculum for metallurgy, anything that has to do with ecology and ethics of mining?
Yeah, so we talk about things like societal and ecological impacts, right? So that's part of the curriculum, right? We're looking at things like in my class this semester, right? I have kind of a research and writing assignment looking at the impacts of Coldhand mining and Cobalt mining in the DRC, right? Looking at the humanitarian, ecological, and economic impacts of Cobalt. Is kind of explore that realm a little more, right? As engineers, it's very easy to be very focused on chemistry, right? You know, copper sulfate plus 2 electrons equals copper metal plus H plus, right? But trying to incorporate that societal impact is an important part of the curriculum. We try and put part of that in every class course we offer. So that's definitely been part of the design process. That societal impact is a part of the design process. We look at things. It's in courses like hydrometallurgy. I tried to do that in pyrometallurgy last year, right? Looking at energy cost, energy flows, and how that works. So we try and tie things into that. That being said, I don't have the expertise of somebody like an environmental engineer, but we try and tie in those economic, ecological, and societal impacts into the course as well as we go along. That's it. Excellent question. Yeah. That's my plug for our school there. Any other questions? Any questions from the cyberspace? No? All right. I guess we start
Carlson. Just wanted to let everybody know, we do this every third Tuesday. So next month's talk is on May 17th. And it will be Anya Hartpence, who is an employee of the US Geological Survey and a volunteer NASA Solar System Ambassador. She is going to talk about the Landsat satellites that went up in 1972 and the images that they've seen in 50 years and the impacts that has had on humanity in general. So that's pretty interesting. So 6 o'clock, May 17th, hope to see you then.